In the heart of Ogbete Market, the aroma of sizzling meat filled the air, drawing customers from far and wide. The bustling market was known for its variety of stalls, selling everything from fresh vegetables to colorful fabrics. But there was one stall that stood out above the rest, Mama Nneka's meat stand. Her meat was unlike anything anyone had ever tasted, tender and seasoned to perfection. People swore by it, claiming it was the best meat they had ever eaten. No one questioned her success. In fact, no one dared to, not with her warm smile and the motherly charm she exuded. Everyone knew Mama Nneka as the woman who brought joy to the market through her cooking. However, what no one knew was the dark secret that lay beneath her delicious meat, how she had managed to maintain an ever-growing customer base despite fierce competition. Mama Nneka, whose full name was Nneka Obianuju, had grown up in a small village far from Ogbete. Her grandmother, a stern but wise woman, had raised her after her parents passed away. Mama Nneka had learned much from her grandmother, how to cook, how to sell, and how to make ends meet even in the toughest times. But her grandmother had also taught her something else, something that clung to the shadows of Nneka's memory. When you want people to flock to you, to eat from your hands, to never leave your side, her grandmother had whispered one evening, sitting on a weathered stool by the fire, "There is a way. You must go where the dead lie. The water they bathe them with, yes, that water, holds power. Use it wisely, my child, and people will come to you like flies to honey." Nneka had never believed in her grandmother's stories back then. The old woman was superstitious, always talking about spirits and the unseen forces that guided life. But many years later, when Nneka found herself struggling in Ogbete's bustling market, desperate for a way to stand out, she remembered the strange advice. It was an idea so absurd, yet as the days went by and the clamor of competition grew louder, the absurdity of the thought began to fade. What harm could it do to try? So one fateful morning before dawn broke, Nneka made her way to the mortuary on the outskirts of town. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the grim-looking building, its air thick with the scent of formaldehyde and death. It was here that she met Chukwudi, the mortuary attendant. Chukwudi, a lanky man with sallow cheeks and tired eyes, was surprised to see her. "Mama Nneka," he said, wiping his hands on a blood-stained apron. "What brings you here so early?" "I've come for something unusual," she said softly, careful to keep her tone respectful. "I need the water, the one you use to bathe the dead." Chukwudi's eyes narrowed in confusion. "The bath water? Why would you want that?" Nneka's gaze shifted, searching for the right words. "It's for a special recipe," she explained, though the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Chukwudi chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "You cooks and your strange ways. All right, Mama Nneka, if that's what you need. Just don't tell anyone where it came from." And so, from that day forward, every morning before the market opened, Nneka would visit Chukwudi and collect the water. She mixed it into her marinades and used it to clean the meat before roasting it over the fire. To her amazement, the results were immediate. Customers began flocking to her stall, praising her cooking as if it were touched by the gods. Her small stall became the talk of Ogbete, and soon she couldn't keep up with the demand. Even Chukwudi himself became one of her most loyal customers, unknowingly consuming the very water he used to cleanse the dead. He would often stop by after a long shift, relishing the rich flavors of her meat, never suspecting the twisted origin of its seasoning. Mama Nneka's success grew, and with it, her reputation. She expanded her stall, hired more help, and became the envy of every vendor in the market. People came from neighboring towns just to taste her famous meat, and she was crowned the undisputed queen of Ogbete Market. But behind the fame and fortune, a gnawing guilt began to grow inside her. As the days passed, she found herself unable to sleep, haunted by nightmares of the dead, faces she had never seen before but somehow recognized. Their eyes, cold and lifeless, seemed to follow her everywhere she went, whispering her name. Mama Nneka's fame spread quickly across the region. Traders passing through Ogbete Market would take home tales of her unforgettable meat, and soon enough, people from neighboring towns began making pilgrimages just to taste her cooking. Business was booming. Her stall, once a small, humble setup, was now a well-decorated, bustling corner of the market, adorned with brightly colored canopies, hand-painted signs, and the constant sound of sizzling meat. But success came with a price. Every morning, as the first light broke over Ogbete, Nneka would make her usual trip to the mortuary. Her visits had become routine, almost mechanical, as she went through the motions of collecting the bathwater without a second thought. Yet, with each visit, her unease deepened. She could no longer ignore the weight of what she was doing, the secret that clung to her every waking moment. Chukwudi, oblivious to the ritual that had taken root, still greeted her with his usual tired smile, a faint hint of amusement in his voice whenever she asked for the water. He never questioned her strange request, and Nneka never explained. She told herself it was simply tradition, just like her grandmother had said, nothing more. But the nightmares persisted. At first, they had been fleeting, dark, shapeless dreams of the dead, with faceless bodies lying in the dim light of the mortuary. Yet as time went on, the dreams grew clearer, sharper. The faces of the dead now appeared in startling detail, their eyes hollow, their mouths moving in silent whispers. They called her name, beckoning her to come closer. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Despite the nightmares, the days in Ogbete were brighter than ever. The customers were still coming, their praises louder and more frequent. But Nneka could not ignore the slow unraveling of her spirit. She began to feel the pull of her grandmother's words like a curse. What had seemed like harmless wisdom now felt like a dark contract, a bargain she could not escape. One afternoon, as she stood behind her stall, busy tending to her roaring fire and carving thick slices of meat for eager customers, a familiar face emerged from the crowd. It was Adaora, a childhood friend Nneka had not seen in years. They had grown up together in the same village, running barefoot through the fields and sharing secrets under the wide African sky. Adaora's smile was warm, her eyes shining with recognition. "Nneka! I can't believe it's really you," Adaora said, rushing toward her with open arms. Nneka wiped her hands on her apron and hugged her friend tightly. "Adaora, it's been too long. What brings you to Ogbete?" Adaora stepped back, glancing around at the bustling market. "I've heard about your famous meat. I just had to come and taste it for myself." Nneka's heart fluttered in her chest. Her old friend had come all this way just to eat her food. But beneath the joy of the reunion, a small voice inside her warned against letting someone she cared about eat the meat she had prepared with such a secretive ingredient. She smiled, trying to shake off the creeping guilt. "Of course you must try it. You'll love it." Adaora grinned as Nneka sliced a piece of her juiciest cut, handing it over with pride. She watched intently as Adaora took her first bite. Her friend's eyes widened, and she let out a soft moan of delight. "Nneka, this is amazing!" Adaora exclaimed, licking her lips. "I've never tasted anything like it." Nneka forced a smile, her stomach twisting into knots. She felt a pang of regret as she watched Adaora devour the meat with enthusiasm. Her friend's praise, once something that would have filled her with pride, now felt hollow and dissonant. As the afternoon wore on, Nneka's mind wandered back to the nightmares, the faces of the dead that haunted her sleep. There had been one face in particular that stood out, a young woman, perhaps no older than 20, with long black hair and a deep scar across her cheek. The young woman's eyes had followed Nneka through her dreams, growing more vivid with each passing night. That night, the dream returned, once again. Nneka stood in the mortuary, the dim light casting eerie shadows across the tiled floor. The air was thick and heavy, and the smell of death lingered in the corners of the room. The young woman with the scar was there, lying on a slab, her eyes open, staring up at the ceiling. Nneka's heart raced as she stepped closer, unable to stop herself. "Nneka," the woman whispered, her voice soft and raspy. "Why have you taken what is ours?" Nneka froze, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to speak, but no words came out. "You think you can feed the living with the waters of the dead?" the woman continued, her voice growing louder, echoing through the room. "There is a price, nneka. There is always a price." Nneka jolted awake, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. She looked around, disoriented, the remnants of the dream clinging to her like a heavy shroud. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the window. She could still hear the woman's voice echoing in her ears, her words a chilling reminder of the path Nneka had chosen. The next morning, Nneka hesitated before making her usual trip to the mortuary. The weight of her secret had become unbearable, and the nightmares had begun to blur the lines between her waking life and her dreams. But the pull of her grandmother's words was strong, and the fear of losing everything she had worked for was stronger still. As she approached the mortuary, the familiar scent of death filled her nostrils. But today, it felt different, heavier, more oppressive. Chukwudi greeted her with the same tired smile, but Nneka could no longer meet his gaze. She quickly collected the water, her hands trembling as she poured it into her container. That day at the market, Nneka worked in silence, her mind racing with thoughts of the dead and the price she had yet to pay. Customers still flocked to her stall, praising her cooking, but their words felt distant, like echoes in a far-off room. She barely registered their compliments, her heart heavy with the weight of the secret she carried. As the sun began to set, Nneka packed up her stall, her movements slow and deliberate. The market was emptying out, the once bustling streets now quiet and still. She glanced around, her eyes lingering on the shadows that crept along the edges of the market. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw her, the young woman from her dreams. Standing in the distance, her long black hair flowing in the breeze, the scar on her cheek glinting in the fading light. Nneka's blood ran cold. She blinked, but the woman did not disappear. She stood there, watching, waiting. Nneka's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly backed away, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the cobblestone streets as she fled into the night. But no matter how far she ran, Nneka knew one thing for certain. There was no escaping the dead. For days, the figure of the young woman haunted Nneka. Even when the sun blazed brightly over Ogbete, the market teeming with life and laughter, Nneka could not shake the image of her in the distance, watching, waiting. The once joyous atmosphere of her bustling meat stall now felt suffocating. Every customer that praised her cooking only reminded her of the water she used and the faces of the dead. Her hands shook as she sliced through the meat, her heart hammering in her chest as if the whispers of the dead were drawing closer with every chop of the cleaver. The nightmares worsened. Nneka dreamed of standing in front of rows upon rows of corpses, their lifeless bodies bathed in the dim glow of lanterns. They were watching her with hollow eyes, their mouths twisted in silent screams. The woman with the scarred face was always there, standing just beyond her reach, whispering the same words over and over. "There is a price, Nneka. There is always a price." One night, after another sleepless bout with her haunting dreams, Nneka could no longer take it. The guilt, the fear. It was too much. Her grandmother's old words, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a dark curse she had willingly bound herself to. The market had given her success, but what had it taken from her soul? Her mind returned to her grandmother's house in the village. How simple things had been back then. How much she had trusted her grandmother. She could still hear her soft but stern voice. "Don't be afraid of what you cannot see, Nneka. When the living fear the dead fear nothing." Those words, spoken in the flicker of firelight years ago, now held a different weight. What had once been a lifeline now felt like a chain. She wondered whether her grandmother had ever paid the price she spoke of, whether her grandmother had ever faced the dead in the way Nneka was now forced to. One afternoon, just after the market had slowed and the crowd thinned, Chukwudi stopped by her stall. His face was pale, more drained than usual, and his eyes darted nervously from side to side. "Mama Nneka," he began, his voice low. "I need to talk to you." Nneka stiffened, setting down her knife. "What is it?" Chukwudi leaned in closer, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure no one could overhear. "Strange things have been happening at the mortuary," he whispered. "I've been doing this job for years, you know that. But lately, I don't know. Something doesn't feel right. The bodies, He hesitated, swallowing hard. "They don't look at rest anymore." Nneka's blood ran cold, her hands suddenly feeling too heavy. She looked into Chukwudi's eyes and saw the fear mirrored in her own heart. "They don't look at rest?" Nneka's voice cracked, and she already knew what he was going to say. Chukwudi nodded, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "Last week, I saw one of the corpses. It moved, Nneka. I swear it. I thought I was losing my mind, but it wasn't just me. The other attendants, they've seen things too. Eyes opening, fingers twitching. And it's always the ones I've bathed recently." Nneka's mouth went dry. She struggled to find her voice. "The ones you've bathed." Chukwudi nodded again, his face pale. "It's like they're trying to tell us something. I don't know what's happening, but something feels off. Dark." Nneka couldn't breathe. The room seemed to close in on her as the weight of Chukwudi's words pressed down on her chest. The dead. They were trying to communicate, and she knew, deep down, that it was because of her. She managed to force a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe it's just your mind playing tricks on you," she said weakly. "You've been working there for too long. The mortuary can do that to a person." Chukwudi frowned but didn't press further. "Maybe, but still, something's not right. Be careful, Mama Nneka." With that, he walked away, disappearing into the bustling market. Nneka stood frozen, her heart pounding as his words echoed in her mind. The dead are not at rest. The next few days were agonizing. Nneka continued her usual routine, but she felt like a puppet, her movements automatic, her mind elsewhere. Every morning, she still made the trip to the mortuary, collecting the bath water without daring to look too closely at the bodies. She couldn't risk it. She didn't want to see the faces she had been seeing in her dreams. But she could feel it. The weight of their stares, the tug of something pulling her deeper into the darkness. One evening, as she prepared to close her stall, a man approached her. He was dressed in traditional attire, his face old and weathered, but his eyes were sharp and knowing. "Mama Nneka," he greeted her, his voice calm and steady. Nneka looked up, forcing a polite smile. "Good evening, sir. How may I help you?" The man's gaze bore into hers, and for a moment, it felt as if he could see straight into her soul. "I've heard of your famous meat," he said slowly. "But I've also heard of something else." Nneka's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The man leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know your secret, Nneka. I know what you use." A wave of cold panic swept over her. She took a step back, her mind racing. How could he know? No one knew. She had been careful. So careful. "Who are you?" Nneka whispered, her throat tightening. "I am someone who understands the weight of certain choices," the man replied cryptically. "The dead are restless, Nneka. They do not take kindly to being used. You think you can take what belongs to them and go unpunished?" Nneka's mouth went dry. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She could barely think, her thoughts swirling in a storm of fear and disbelief. The man's expression softened, but there was no kindness in his eyes. "There is still time to make it right," he said. "But you must act soon. The dead are patient, but not forever. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Nneka standing alone in the fading light of the market. Her heart pounded in her chest as the weight of his words settled over her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like the thin veil of her success had been torn apart, revealing the dark truth she had tried so hard to hide. The dead were coming for her. She could feel it in her bones. That night, Nneka sat in her small home, the silence pressing down on her. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of her fear. She couldn't escape it. The nightmares, the whispers, the faces of the dead, always watching. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the path she had chosen. But now, those words felt like a curse, a chain she had willingly wrapped around her neck. Nneka knew what she had to do. She couldn't keep running. She couldn't keep hiding from the consequences of her actions. The next morning, she would return to the mortuary, not to collect the water, but to confront the dead themselves. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth and dew as Nneka made her way to the mortuary. It was still dark, the sky barely tinged with the promise of dawn. Her footsteps echoed on the cobblestone path, each step heavier than the last, as though the weight of her past was bearing down on her. Nneka's heart pounded in her chest, but her mind was calm. She had made her decision. She could no longer live under the shadow of her actions. The man's words the night before had struck deep. The dead were restless, and if she did not make amends, she feared the price she would pay would be more than she could bear. The mortuary loomed ahead, a grim silhouette against the faint light of the morning. It looked different now. No longer just a place of business, but a doorway into something darker, something she had never truly understood. Nneka hesitated at the entrance, her hand hovering over the door. She could hear her grandmother's voice in her head once again. When the living fear the dead fear nothing. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Inside, the air was cold, the familiar smell of death and formaldehyde filling her nostrils. The mortuary was quiet, the kind of quiet that seemed unnatural, like the silence after a storm. Chukwudi wasn't there yet, and for that, Nneka was grateful. She needed to do this alone. She walked through the hallway, past the small office where Chukwudi kept his records, and entered the main room where the bodies were laid out on cold metal slabs. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering light, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The bodies were covered in white sheets, their forms barely visible beneath the cloth. Nneka's hands trembled as she approached the first slab, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. She hesitated, then pulled the sheet back. It was the young woman from her dreams. The scar on her cheek was unmistakable, her long black hair spread across the slab like a dark river. Her eyes were closed, but Nneka could feel her presence, as though she was still watching, still waiting. Nneka took a step back, her chest tightening with fear. She had come here to make things right, but now, standing before the dead, she realized she had no idea how. What could she possibly do to undo the harm she had caused? The flickering light above her buzzed loudly, and for a moment the room seemed to grow darker. A chill ran down Nneka's spine as she looked around, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could feel them now, the dead. Their presence was thick in the air, like a weight pressing down on her. Nneka swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke. "I'm sorry," she said, her words trembling in the cold air. "I never meant to. I didn't know it would come to this." Silence. The room was so still that Nneka could hear her own heartbeat, loud and erratic in her chest. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I was desperate. I needed to survive, to stand out in the market. I thought—" Her throat tightened, tears welling in her eyes. I thought it was harmless." The silence was deafening. Neka's hands clenched into fists as she stood before the bodies, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the dead all around her, their cold presence wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. The air was thick with their unspoken accusation. "I was wrong," Neka whispered, her voice cracking. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Please, forgive me." The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows on the walls lengthening as if the dead were drawing closer. Neka's breath hitched in her throat, her body trembling with fear. She had expected something, an answer, a sign, anything to show that they had heard her. But there was only silence. Then, a voice. "Neka." It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a jolt of fear through her body. Neka spun around, her eyes wide, but the room was empty. The bodies lay still on their slabs, untouched. "Neka." The voice again, closer this time. It wasn't just any voice, it was the voice from her dreams, the voice of the young woman with the scar. Nneka's heart raced as she turned back toward the slab, her hands trembling. The young woman's eyes were open. Nneka let out a gasp, stumbling backward, her hand flying to her mouth. The young woman stared at her with cold, unblinking eyes, her lips parted as though she was about to speak. "Nneka," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with a terrible certainty. "There is always a price." Nneka's knees gave way, and she fell to the ground, her heart pounding in her ears. The room seemed to close in on her, the shadows growing darker, colder, until she could barely see the young woman's face. "You took what did not belong to you," the woman continued, her voice low and haunting. "You used us. You fed the living with the water of the dead." Tears streamed down Nneka's face as she shook her head. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know. But you did it anyway," the woman interrupted, her voice sharper now, filled with a quiet rage. "And now we are restless. We cannot find peace." Nneka's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared into the woman's eyes, her mind racing. What could she do? How could she fix this? "What can I do?" Nneka cried, her voice breaking. "Tell me how to make this right." For a moment, the room was silent again, the young woman's eyes piercing Nneka's soul. Then, slowly, the woman's lips curved into a slight smile, but there was no warmth in it. Only a cold, calculating certainty. "You must pay the price, Nneka," she whispered. "Only then will we rest." Nneka's heart sank. She knew what the woman meant. She had known all along, but she had refused to accept it. The dead were asking for a sacrifice, her sacrifice. The next day, Ogbete market was unusually quiet. People whispered among themselves as they passed by Mama Nneka's stall, which remained closed, the usual sizzle of her famous meat absent. The air felt heavy, and many wondered what had happened to the woman who had become such a fixture in their lives. Some said they had seen her leave the market before dawn, her face pale and drawn, as though she had seen something that had shaken her to the core. Others said they had seen her heading toward the mortuary, her steps slow and deliberate, as if she was walking toward something she couldn't escape. But no one saw her after that. Days passed, and Nneka did not return to her stall. The once vibrant corner of the market was now abandoned, the fire in her grill long cold. Customers who had once flocked to her for a taste of her famous meat now passed by with a shiver, as though the very air around her stall was haunted by something unseen. Chukwudi, too, noticed her absence. He had seen Nneka often, their strange ritual of water collection, a routine he had come to accept without question. But when she didn't show up one morning, then another, he felt a gnawing sense of dread. Eventually, he made his way to her house, hoping to find her there. But the house was empty. The bed was untouched. The only sign of Nneka's presence was the faint smell of roasting meat that seemed to linger in the air, though there was no fire to be seen. As time went on, People in Ogbete market spoke less and less of Mama Nneka. Her disappearance became a part of the market's lore, a cautionary tale whispered among the traders and vendors. Some said she had gone mad and wandered off into the forest, never to return. Others believed she had angered the spirits and had been taken by them, her soul lost to the restless dead. But no one really knew what had happened to Nneka. All that remained was her empty stall and the eerie silence that seemed to hang over it, a reminder of the price she had paid for her success.